In recent years, Star Wars fans have been lucky enough to get a whole host of new Star Wars content covering the period between the declaration of a new order and the declaration of the New Republic. Many animated series and live-action shows have all taken place during this period, filling in the gaps between Episode 3 and Episode 4. However, as many of you know, with the acquisition of Lucasfilm, we've seen a line drawn between canon and Legends, two timelines that differ wildly between themselves. Most modern media adds on to the canon timeline, but in many ways, Legends has always been the more epic of the two. That's why in this series, we'll be covering a less popular topic, at least as far as our viewership is concerned, as seen through Legends, the Galactic Civil War. We've spoken at length about how canon and Legends Luke Skywalker differed and how their paths after the rebellion split dramatically, but this sort of divergence began long before the Battle of Endor. From the very beginning, canon and Legends differ in the most fundamental ways, and in this series, we'll be taking a detailed look at the major conflict that marked the Galactic Civil War in Legends, from the birth of the Rebel Alliance all the way to its triumphant victory.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Like with any good story, we have to begin at the very beginning. After the fall of the Republic, there had been many isolated skirmishes, battles, and planetary rebellions. Fans will remember the revolution on Ryloth, for example, and all of Saw Gerrera's activities. But isolated incidents do not a civil war make. All these conflicts were part of a greater issue, galactic dissatisfaction with Palpatine's totalitarian regime, but they weren't part of a greater movement. A true civil war requires an organized rebel front, and that didn't form officially until 2 BBY. For 17 years, senators like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma had lain in wait, plotting and planning. They attempted to use politics and diplomacy to curb the atrocities of the Empire, all while putting together their allies and forces. They had identified that the Empire Palpatine had created was irreversibly corrupt and a grotesque mockery of democracy, and so they vowed to bring it down and restore the Republic. Thus, in 2 BBY, 3 senators gathered on Corellia, brought together by a mysterious Force user known as Starkiller. The first was Garmbel Iblis of Corellia, who consolidated all rebel forces on the planet under one banner. The other two were Bail Organa of Alderaan and Mon Mothma of Chandrila, two of the leading figures of anti-imperial sentiment in the Senate. The three met on Corellia to continue their discussions on potential revolt, accompanied by a former Jedi general and several rebel units. The talks that took place became known as the Corellian System Meetings, during which the rebellion's leaders drafted the Corellian Treaty, a codification of their ideals and goals. By signing the treaty, the senators unified their individual rebel selves into one cohesive rebellion with united goals, a formalized front, and clear hierarchy. However, what the rebels didn't know was that Starkiller, born Galen Marek, was secretly the Sith apprentice of Darth Vader. The entire meeting had been a trap, orchestrated by Emperor Palpatine to gather all his enemies in one place so that they could be disposed of and made an example of. Marek, meanwhile, believed that he and his master, Darth Vader, were using Palpatine's plan against him. The moment the Emperor was distracted by a unified front of insurrectionists, they would strike him down and take his place. Unfortunately for Marek, he had been lied to. No sooner had the 3 senators signed the Corellian Treaty than Imperial forces flooded the meeting chambers, dispatching their guards effortlessly. Rahm Kota, the Jedi, drew his saber in preparation to defend the rebel leaders, but he was deterred from acting when Darth Vader himself strode in and confronted his apprentice, who felt betrayed once he realized he had been used. The plan had never been to dethrone Palpatine, but to gather the rebels and execute all of them. A duel broke out between Vader and his former apprentice. The droid Proxy briefly interfered, but Vader was too powerful to be reckoned with. He easily overpowered Marek, throwing him first out of the meeting chamber, then off the snowy cliff. Believing him dead, the Imperial forces took the senators and Jedi Kota prisoners, bringing them on board the still incomplete Death Star, where Palpatine awaited them. Palpatine declared they would be interrogated, tortured, then executed. Of course, the story didn't just end there. If it had, the rebellion would have never truly happened. Marek had survived. Not only that, but his master's betrayal had been enough to tip him over the edge onto the side of the rebellion. Up until then, Marek had been on the fence, but now he was out for Sith blood. Ambushing an Imperial patrol carrying Wookiee slaves, he used the shuttle to infiltrate the Death Star and, with the slaves free and wreaking havoc, he made his way through the waves of stormtroopers and into the Imperial throne room. Along the way, he faced countless soldiers armed with blaster rifles and laser cannons, but none were enough to deter him. Just before Marek barged into the throne room, Palpatine had been informing his prisoners that they would be tortured and interrogated for more information on other rebel cells before finally being executed for treason. When Marek interrupted him, he immediately saw Palpatine for who he was. Not the frail Emperor, but a powerful Dark Lord. Irritated by the interruption, Palpatine ordered Vader to kill his apprentice. The duel in the throne room between master and apprentice was fierce, but brief. Despite Vader's overwhelming superiority with the lightsaber, Marek was skilled in more subtle ways of fighting, like telekinesis. As they fought, Marek couldn't help but feel awed at his master's strength. He realized he didn't hate him. Having let go of his connection with the dark side, he vowed to free Vader from its grip by taking his life and returning him to the Force. The duel was grueling, but over time, Marek gained the advantage, looking for a single opening. When Vader stumbled, encumbered by his armor and prosthetics, Marek struck. One successful blow led to another, until Vader lay on the floor of the throne room, alive, but critically wounded. It was then that Palpatine reached out with the Force, attempting to influence him into ending Vader's life and taking his place at the Emperor's side. Luckily for Marek, however, Rahm Kota refused to allow the Emperor to lure him back to the dark side. In a burst of energy, he used the Force to steal the Emperor's lightsaber and rushed him, cutting down several guards in his attempt to cut Sidious down with his own weapon. Sidious fought back by unleashing a wave of Sith lightning at the Jedi. Marek, however, interposed himself between them, absorbing the lightning and locking Palpatine and himself into an endless loop of lightning. While the senators were evacuated onto Marek's starship, the Rogue Shadow, Marek held the Emperor in place. Once they had left, he allowed the built-up energy to explode out of himself, killing everyone but Vader and Sidious. It cost him his life, but it bought the lives of the rebel leaders, who were taken by Juno Eclipse, Marek's pilot, to Kashyyyk. There, the rebel leaders formally declared the birth of the Alliance to restore the Republic, plunging the galaxy into a new civil war. Darth Sidious was left furious, as a trap that had been intended to decapitate the snake of the rebellion only resulted in them being inspired by Marek's sacrifice to take his empire down. Not only that, but Marek's final play had caused significant damage to the Death Star, delaying its deployment for another 2 years. But for the time being, the Galactic Civil War had officially begun, and its first battle had already resulted in a rebel victory. During its first year of life, the Rebel Alliance spent most of its efforts in gathering its strength, organizing once scattered rebel cells, and structuring its hierarchy and armed forces. However, that doesn't mean they sat idly by and waited for the Empire to muster its own forces and hunt them down. Alongside its efforts to solidify their presence, the Alliance also executed sabotage runs to loot valuable resources or undermine Imperial operations. One such run resulted in the Alliance's first open battles with the Galactic Empire. Somewhere between 2 and 1 BBY, the Rebel Alliance gathered intelligence that Grand Moff Wilhoth Tarkin and Bevel Lemelisk were en route to the Death Star. Tarkin was, of course, one of the most powerful men in the Empire, both from a political and military standpoint. A former Republic admiral, he had openly embraced the Galactic Empire and its change in regime, and was the driving force behind many of the doctrine changes in the new Imperial military. Tarkin held many problematic beliefs he had been unable to fully express while the Republic was in power, and now that the Empire had done away with many of the Republic's qualms and morals, he had been unleashed upon the galaxy. We won't go into too much nauseating detail here, but if you want a more detailed explanation of Tarkin's humanocentric and fascist drivel, we have a video dedicated to the different ideologies of this time period, including that of the Empire. In an effort to combat what he saw as trans-sector criminal and rebel activities, Tarkin had proposed several system overhauls, many of which the Empire had labelled a success. Gradually, he had risen through the ranks until he obtained the title of Grand Moff and was given the reins to several keystone projects. One of these was the creation of the Death Star itself, which Tarkin believed would be enough of a fear deterrent to keep the galaxy's citizens in line. The man accompanying him on that Lambda-class shuttle, Bevel Lemelisk, wasn't much better. An engineer and architect by trade, he was the mastermind behind the Death Star's design. Earlier in his career, he had worked for the Galactic Republic, studying under other famous scientists such as Nasra Margrady and working with other renowned architects such as Dr. Walex Blissex. Together with the latter, he designed the Victory 1 class Star Destroyer, which had been a game changer during the Clone Wars and would remain in use in naval armadas for decades to come. After the fall of the Republic, Tarkin had brought him onto the Death Star project to engineer a battle station that could literally destroy entire worlds. At this point in time, Lemelisk had designed the Death Star prototype and the first Death Star, but later on, he'd be responsible for 4 more superweapons. All too aware of the Death Star's terrifying potential, when the Alliance received intelligence that the 2 masterminds behind the Battle Station project were together on a single shuttle heading toward the Death Star, they knew they had to seize the opportunity to take them out, hopefully preventing the station from ever being completed. Thus, they launched an operation to intercept the Lambda-class shuttle the 2 were on before it rendezvoused with the Nebulon B frigate Vehemence in the Eriadu system. Now, as much as we enjoy pointing out every time the Empire was overconfident or complacent in their plans, comfortable in their military superiority, they weren't completely incompetent. The Imperial military had managed to secure its hold over the galaxy without stumbling despite many localized conflicts. Tarkin especially was no fool, which was part of why he was such a danger. Imperial Command was all too aware that transporting the 2 men behind the Death Star project on the same shuttle was a huge security risk, so they had taken precautions to prevent Tarkin from being taken in the event of an ambush. In total, 6 Lambda-class shuttles set off from Eriadu toward the Death Star, with Tarkin and Lemelisk riding in one of them. Tarkin's shuttle and the 4 decoys were accompanied by 6 TIE fighters. That might sound like insufficient protection, and it was, by Tarkin's design. The Grand Moff believed that a larger protection detail would have drawn significantly more attention to what would otherwise have seemed as a minor personnel or cargo transport heading to the battle station. Less attention on their convoy meant less chance of a dedicated attempt to take them down, and it also meant less attention on the Death Star's real location. The 5 shuttles left Eriadu's governor's palace with their attachment of TIE fighters heading through the sector. The shuttle Tarkin and Lemelisk were on had the codename Epsilon 5. Coincidentally perhaps, it was piloted by none other than Gial Ackbar himself, a Mon Calamari that had seen plenty of action already. Ackbar had started his career on Mon Cala, where he was the commanding officer in the Mon Calamari Guard. During the Battle of Mon Cala in the Clone Wars, he had participated in the battle assuring Prince Li Char's ascension to the throne. After the Clone Wars, Mon Cala was enslaved by the Galactic Empire, and Ackbar found himself a slave to Wilhuf Tarkin. As the Imperial shuttles and TIEs approached the Vehemence, a small rebel assault team exited hyperspace and launched a surprise attack. The rebel force was made up of 3 BLT Y-Wing starfighters piloted by Red Squadron and several X-Wings. The latter wasted no time after entering the system before they engaged the TIEs, destroying them and creating space for the Y-Wings to shoot through and open fire on the Imperial shuttles. Face to face with the incoming starfighters, Tarkin ordered Ackbar to take evasive action. Instead of obeying the Grand Moff, Ackbar deactivated the shuttle's shields, fully intending on allowing the rebels to destroy the shuttle. While it meant his certain death, it also meant the death of Tarkin, and to the Mon Cala, that was a sacrifice worth making. Red Squadron was able to identify their shuttle and, after determining that Tarkin had to be on board, they shot at the shuttle, destroying its rear and sending it veering off course. Ackbar gleefully informed Tarkin he was taking him down as payback for every ounce of suffering the Moff had inflicted on himself and his people, but Tarkin wasn't deterred. The Grand Moff and Lemelisk boarded an escape pod, leaving Ackbar to his likely doom. Although the escape pod was built for a single occupant, resulting in both Tarkin and Lemelisk suffering minor injuries, they successfully launched off into space, from where they sent out a distress signal. Meanwhile, Red Squadron continued firing on Epsilon 5 until it had been disabled. Once the frontal assault team had determined all shuttles had been disabled, a Lambda-class shuttle, Hasty, entered the system, transporting a commando unit on board and 2 Y-Wing starfighters from Blue Squadron. The Vehements had attempted to aid the transport shuttles, sending out 9 additional TIEs, but the rebel starfighters from both Red and Blue Squadron made easy work of them, providing cover for Hasty to approach Epsilon 5 and dock with it, allowing the commandos to board the shuttle. Aboard Epsilon 5, they learned that Tarkin and Lemelisk had escaped, but they found Ackbar alive. Meanwhile, Tarkin and Lemelisk watched the battle unfold as their escape pod travelled ever farther away. Tarkin was surprised that the Rebel Alliance would bother to rescue Ackbar, whom he considered a worthless alien, but it wouldn't take long for the Grand Moff to be proven critically wrong in his evaluation. Before the rebels could veer off and pursue Tarkin's escape pod, Imperial Admiral Conan Antonio Motti arrived in his flagship despite Tarkin not having requested his aid for the mission. The Admiral's Star Destroyer opened fire on the rebels, which forced them to scatter and abandon pursuit of Tarkin's escape pod. With Ackbar safely removed from the Epsilon 5, the rebels destroyed the shutter entirely before fleeing to hyperspace. Tarkin and Lemelisk were rescued by the Admiral, and the two continued on their way to the Death Star. Despite their failure to capture Tarkin, the mission was far from a failure for the Rebel Alliance. Having been at Tarkin's side as his slave, Ackbar had a wealth of knowledge and information about the Death Star, which would prove invaluable moving forward. After Ackbar was liberated, he was allowed to return to his home planet, where he resumed his duties as Admiral of the Mon Cala fleet. This was particularly important because, up to this point, the Mon Cala had been hesitant to join the side of the Alliance. Like many other planetary resistance groups like Ryloth, they had been hesitant to join the Greater Alliance, focusing instead on their efforts to liberate their homeworld. Ackbar's return to his people served as a glowing recommendation of the Alliance, and it was his support and approval that eventually led the Mon Cala to pledge their support and fleet to the Alliance. But the events of the capture-turned-rescue mission didn't end there. Ackbar wasn't just instrumental in gaining the support of the Mon Cala. His tactical genius and talents proved critical to the Rebel Alliance, which he served as an admiral with high distinction during the Galactic Civil War. At the end of the day, the Alliance may have failed to apprehend Tarkin, but the intelligence, support, and talent they gained in return made the rescue of Ackbar one of the most pivotal early successes of the Alliance. The third significant conflict we'll be taking a look at today took place in 1 BBY, when Starkiller stepped in to rescue Jedi Rahm Kota from a deadly arena on Cato Nemoidia. But let's back up for a moment. You'll remember Rahm Kota from the Battle of Death Star 1, when he and 3 senators were captured by Darth Vader while they were signing the Corellian Treaty. After Gial and Marek's sacrifice and their escape from the incomplete battle station, Rahm Kota had remained in service to the Rebel Alliance, commanding a unit of troops and launching various missions on behalf of the Alliance. That said, he had gained a reputation for himself of someone unreliable. This was because, for the most part, he tended to act without authorization from higher-ranking members of the Alliance, instead choosing where and when he would act and taking his squad with him as if they were acting alone. Kota, as you might be able to tell, was a bit of a rebel, and on one occasion in 1 BBY, his independence really came back to bite him. In 1 BBY, Kota led a team of his men on an unsanctioned raid to Cato Nemoidia, which took a quick turn for the worst. Kota's squad were all killed, and the Jedi himself was captured by Baron Marillion Tarko, appointed governor of Cato Nemoidia and Imperial Plant. Now, the governor was certainly a character. Hailing from the core world of Anaxis, Tarko had attended the Anaxis Citadel in his youth, graduated with the highest honors, and found his way into the Republic military. During the Clone Wars, he was assigned to a Republic flagship, and by the end of the war, he was on the fast track to power, through means less than savory if we had to guess. When the Republic fell and the Empire took its place, Tarko's political and military career only blossomed. Thanks to Tarkin's commendation, Tarko was promoted to the rank of Moff and given command of the Imperial operations on Cato Nemoidia. He renamed its main bridge city Tarko Se after himself and established a power hub he built up with casinos and a successful slave trade. Once his power base was thriving and his pockets were heavier than they had ever been before, Tarko even opened a for-profit gladiatorial arena. Kota's mission to Cato Nemoidia had been to assassinate Tarko while his team reconnoitered the planet. When they failed, the Jedi was taken prisoner and thrown into the gladiatorial arena, where he was forced to fight for a week straight. Although the Jedi was able to keep fighting off the monsters the Imperial Baron kept throwing at him, It's unlikely he would have survived much longer if Starkiller hadn't swooped in to rescue him. Now, we hear you. Didn't we make a rather big deal about Galen Marek sacrificing himself on board the first Death Star so the others could be evacuated? For those of you familiar with The Force Unleashed, however, you know where this story is going. You see, Darth Vader wasn't particularly pleased with the untimely demise of his former apprentice. Over the last year, he'd been engaged in a secret project on Kamino to clone his former apprentice. He'd been aiming to create a perfect clone of Marek that had all of his former apprentice's skills, but none of his weaknesses. Each clone was given Marek's codename of Starkiller, as Vader was aiming for a clone that was completely disconnected from Galen Marek's life and life choices. The issue was that cloning Force sensitives is far more difficult than cloning non-Force users, like the clone troopers of the Republic, and Vader's experiments resulted in numerous failures. One of those was the Starkiller of this story. During a training session on Kamino, Vader made the mistake of telling Starkiller about Kota's capture on Kota Nemoidia, tasking him with eliminating the clone once his training was completed. However, this clone failed to pass Vader's vigorous tests, unable to fully separate himself from his progenitor's memories, and thus proving himself useless to the Sith's cause. Before Vader cut him down like all the failed experiments before him, Starkiller lashed out at him, pushing him back, then made a run for it. To get off Kamino, he hijacked Vader's personal TIE fighter and escaped, heading straight for Kota Nemoidia to rescue Kota. In part, it was because his progenitor had been fond of the man, but mainly it was because Starkiller had one driving need: to find Juno Eclipse, Galen Marek's pilot and love interest. Since he hadn't changed the codes on the TIE he had stolen, the Imperial garrison on Kota Nemoidia identified Starkiller as Darth Vader when he approached the planet, directing him toward an executive landing pad with his own personal TIE escort. Once he came out of the TIE fighter, he was presented with a stormtrooper honor guard and welcomed by the governor himself, who had never seen Vader and wouldn't have been able to identify him if he'd been force-choked face to face. To his credit, however, the Baron became suspicious once Starkiller asked for Kota's location, and when the clone failed to give local security codes on demand, the Baron ordered his execution. This, understandably, didn't go as Tarkin had wanted. Starkiller made easy work of the stormtroopers, then escaped into the city, taking out or expertly avoiding anything in his way. He evaded everything the Baron had thrown at him, from scout troopers to riot troopers to a Nemesis-class gunship. It didn't take long for him to make his way into Taco Se Arena, where Kota was preoccupied with fighting off yet more beasts. Despite how exhausted and injured the Jedi was after 7 consecutive days of fighting, Kota chose to stay and deal with Taco rather than run away. The Baron was just as eager to see them both dead, which is why, with a nod to his aide, Taco unleashed the Gorog into the arena. If you've never seen a Gorog before, they're larger than life itself. They're a gigantic, twin-hearted and bipedal creature with 2 human hands that stands hunched over. 4 tusks protrude from its lower jaw. They're so large, in fact, that the Gorog released into the Taco Se Arena casually picked up a bull Rancor and snacked on it before turning its attention on the 2 Jedi. While Kota went after the Baron, Starkiller stayed behind to face off against the enormous beast. When ranged attacks such as Force Lightning and Telekinesis had little effect, Starkiller relied on the system of restraints built into the arena to ensnare the creature's arms so that it could leap up at its face and deal serious damage with a combination of heavy lightsaber blows and Force Lightning. Blinded by the pain, the Gorog managed to break free of its restraints and went berserk, lashing out. Its flailing blows began damaging the arena supports, which Starkiller noticed and took advantage of. Leading the creature along, he succeeded in making it destroy the arena supports, causing it to topple off Taco Se and plunge into the acid ocean below. Starkiller himself leapt from the main arena into Taco's personal box, which had separate supports, and the 2 Jedi confronted the Baron and his troops. As they did so, however, the Gorog managed to grab a hold of the box and pull it down with it as it plunged. Taco was almost instantly killed, and was only thanks to Starkiller's intervention that Kota was saved from a similar fate. Thanks to a hidden transponder the Jedi had smuggled in, the 2 escaped aboard the Rogue Shadow and made it to safety. In the aftermath of their escape, Kota and Starkiller disagreed. The former was convinced Starkiller was the original Galen Marek and not a clone, and wanted him to join the rebellion and fight alongside him to bring down the Empire. Meanwhile, Starkiller was almost certain he wasn't the original. All he wanted was to locate Juno Eclipse, but ever since the rebel fleet had been scattered, Kota wasn't sure where she was. In the end, the Jedi gave Starkiller his old ship back and the two parted ways after Starkiller dropped him off on Malastare. In his search for a quiet place to meditate, Starkiller made his way to Dagobah, following a clue Kota had inadvertently dropped. There, he encountered Jedi Master Yoda, who was hiding on the planet in exile. Yoda guided the clone to the planet's dark side cave to meditate, where Starkiller had a vision of the future. In his vision, he saw the rebel fleet. Juno Eclipse was on the bridge of her warship, the Salvation. As his vision ended, he saw her being gravely wounded when the fleet was attacked. Clamoring to prevent the attack, Starkiller quickly reached out to Kota once more, and together, the two began searching for the location of the fleet. Eventually, they managed to pin their location down to the Yutani Nebula. However, what the two didn't know was that Darth Vader had hired a bounty hunter by the name of Boba Fett to capture Juno Eclipse. When Starkiller and Kota arrived at the location of the fleet, Fett launched a surprise attack. While his Imperial strike team dealt with the other rebel craft, the bounty hunter bypassed all other ships, infiltrating the Salvation and abducting Juno Eclipse. Despite the rebels' success in destroying all Imperial ships, Fett still managed to escape with his prisoner. Of course, Vader didn't really want Eclipse for her own merit. He had ordered Boba Fett to capture the former Imperial pilot, knowing full well that she was the focus of Starkiller's obsession. With her in captivity, he had the best chance of luring Starkiller back to the ocean world of his birth, and hopefully back into Vader's grasp. Fortunately or unfortunately, Vader's plan worked perfectly. The aftermath of Fett's surprise strike on the rebel fleet set the stage for the first attack on Kamino in over a decade. Devastated at being unable to save Eclipse, Starkiller was hellbent on going to Kamino to rescue her with or without rebel support. Rahm Kota, seeing this as an opportunity to launch a substantial assault against the Empire, fully supported the clone in attacking Kamino with the rebel fleet support, although he did warn Starkiller that they were almost certainly walking into a trap. Starkiller was convinced Vader would never see an attack from an entire fleet coming, and so the two traveled to Kamino with the rebel fleet behind them, hoping to put an end to Vader's experiments in Tamira City, rescue Juno Eclipse, and deal the Empire a few heavy blows in the process. As anyone could have predicted, Vader had anticipated their plans. He had positioned a fleet of Imperial Star Destroyers in orbit around Kamino, ready to open fire on the rebels the moment they exited hyperspace. The newest battle of Kamino broke out above the planet as soon as the rebels entered the system. The Imperials opened fire immediately, and several boarding parties were sent out to the rebel flagships. One of the ships boarded was the Salvation, which Starkiller was commanding. The clone was forced to cut through the waves of stormtroopers in order to rendezvous with Kota on the ship's bridge so they could assess the situation. It didn't look good for the rebels. From their arrival, the rebels had been losing the naval theater and were taking heavy losses from Vader's Star Destroyers. On the ground, they were unable to cause any damage to Tamira City, as the city's deflector shield was holding their fire at bay and protecting the cloning facility. The only way Starkiller could find to improve their odds was to send the Salvation into a crash landing in Tamira City, hoping to destroy the shield generator so their ground troops could assault the cloning facility. The clone ordered all surviving crew members to abandon the ship, guiding it into position himself. It was a difficult task, piloting the Salvation through the planet's atmosphere, dodging debris when possible. Near the end of his trajectory, the Salvation broke in half. Its rear end crashed into the shield generator, destroying it, while Starkiller guided the front end directly at the spire Darth Vader was using as his command tower. Too late, however, he realized that Juno Eclipse was with him. Destroying Vader meant killing her as well, which was unacceptable. Instead of going through with it, Starkiller used the Force to rip the front half of the Salvation apart, allowing the debris to land wherever. He himself barely survived the fall. Now, he found himself in the same city he had escaped. Facing off against other felled clones of Gial American Imperial soldiers, Starkiller made his way toward an Imperial hangar bay. He and Rahm Kota worked their way through multiple command centers and security controls, trying to find their way into the facility. Finding the ground approach impossible, Starkiller rode a rebel Y-wing onto the facility's dome, from where he ascended to the top of the spire. But Starkiller's steady progress came at a steep cost. Initially, rebel ground forces had been driving the Imperial soldiers back, but it didn't take the Imperials long to muster their forces and push the rebels back. Seeing their ground forces taking heavy losses, Kota implored Starkiller to abandon Juno Eclipse and focus on saving scores more lives. Starkiller refused to aid the rebels, choosing Eclipse over their lives and cause. As a result, Kota and his forces were almost decimated. Against Kota's advice, Starkiller entered the spire, fully prepared to take Vader on alone. He was assaulted multiple times by multiple attackers in the shape of his former master. These were all Sith training droids, disguised as figures from Marek's past in an attempt to break him psychologically. Once Starkiller was able to overcome them, he took off in search of the true Vader. On his way, he had to face off against even more failed clones of Gial and Marek, whom he was able to defeat despite the heavy emotional blow he was dealt in realizing he was nothing more than a failed clone. When he finally found the real Vader, Starkiller was in a rage. The two exchanged heavy blows, but when Starkiller was struck with another vision, this time of Juno Eclipse dead in his arms, Vader took the chance to knock him down and escape. He only got a brief head start before Starkiller caught up to him in the main cloning spire. Meanwhile, the battle outside continued to rage. Boba Fett, who had remained on Vader's orders, retreated into the cloning facilities to evade Kota's troops. Within the facility, Fett discovered an army of clones, not of his father, but of himself, produced in secret form DNA samples that had been taken without his consent. In a rage, the mercenary destroyed the army of clones, the scientist who had created them, and the facility itself. Despite Vader's betrayal, Fett chose to remain on the planet and fulfill his contract of killing Starkiller. Before he could intervene in the duel, however, Kota, the droid proxy, and several of his men engaged him. Although Fett was defeated, he was able to make his escape thanks to a sonic detonator he threw their way, which bought him a small window of time to retreat. When Starkiller finally managed to catch up with Vader at the top of the spire, he demanded the Sith hand over Eclipse. Vader stepped aside to reveal the woman standing behind him, right in front of a large window. The Sith force-choked her, demanding that Starkiller surrender in exchange for her life, which Starkiller quickly agreed to do, discarding his weapons and dropping onto the ground. Vader added that Starkiller had to hunt down and kill Kota, then the remaining rebel leaders. The clone had to embrace the dark side once more and complete his training. If at any stage he failed, Vader would kill his hostage. What both men failed to notice, however, was the incapacitated pilot retrieving one of Starkiller's lightsabers and attacking Vader. The latter was barely able to dodge in time, escaping with his life, but sustaining damage to his chest piece. In a rage, Vader force-pushed her out the window, causing her to fall a great distance onto a neighboring roof, where she lay, presumably dead. Starkiller rushed him, only to meet the same fate. Before the clone could check on Eclipse's condition, Vader force-jumped onto the same roof as them, attacking in earnest. Once more, they fought. It was only then that Starkiller realized that his former master had been one step ahead of him yet again. By luring him to the top of the spire, he had orchestrated the death of Juno Eclipse, where Starkiller could witness it, hoping to use it to push the clone into the embrace of the dark side yet again. Despite his pain, Starkiller tried to bargain Vader into a truce. He even offered for Vader to join the Alliance so they could destroy Emperor Palpatine together, but Vader wasn't receptive to the invitation. If anything, he renewed his assault on the clone, remaining between the clone and the Eclipse, whom Starkiller was desperately trying to reach. Yet again, Vader attempted to attack his psyche, insisting that the woman would never love him truly. Starkiller was nothing more than a clone, and she had feelings only for the original. He pressed the clone to rise above these petty feelings and embrace his true destiny. As they fought, the clone realized that he was incapable of defeating Vader. The Sith Lord, who had already been defeated once at the hands of Marek aboard the first Death Star, knew now not to underestimate the clone. This time, when they dueled, he avoided reckless offense, played more defensively, and relied on his tactics and lightsaber superiority to wear the clone down. The longer the battle dragged on, the more Starkiller realized that he couldn't hope for a repeat of his progenitor's victory. The best outcome he could hope for was a draw, especially given how he knew Vader wanted him alive and was thus not even truly fighting him. In light of these realizations, he devised a plan. It wasn't long before the clone was knocked prone, disarmed by a telekinetic blast. Without hesitating, Vader destroyed the clone's lightsaber, then held him at saber point, demanding his surrender. To Vader's surprise, Starkiller seemed to accept his terms. But that had been Starkiller's plan all along. As Vader lowered his arm, the clone extended an arm, calling on a lightning bolt that had hit one of the rods surrounding their building and channeling it into a powerful blast aimed at Vader's chest. The clone had decided to bet his life on the Sith's desire to keep him alive, counting on him lowering his guard if he surrendered. When the lightning struck Vader, it hit his already damaged chest plate, further compromising his life support systems, rendering the Sith helpless to defend himself as Starkiller force-pulled his lightsaber from his hand. Even held at saber point, Vader never stopped trying to convert the clone back to the dark side. Before Starkiller could execute him, however, Rahm, Kota and his men reached their position. The Jedi insisted that Starkiller spare the Sith, not out of kindness, but opportunity. In Kota's eyes, Vader was far more valuable as a prisoner. With his high rank in the Imperial military, Vader could prove an invaluable source of information on the Empire's dealings and operations. Kota also tried to appeal to Starkiller on a personal level in an attempt to keep the Sith alive, reminding him that Vader was the only person who knew the truth about his status as a clone. In the end, the Jedi's words were enough to convince Starkiller, who spared Vader and allowed his teammates to deal with the prisoner while he finally checked on Juno Eclipse. Unfortunately, the woman seemed truly gone. Despite Proxy's best efforts, she was lifeless in Starkiller's arms, who took the brunt of the blame for her demise. However, out of some miracle, she suddenly stirred and embraced him. What Starkiller didn't know was that Boba Fett and another Marik clone had been on standby to eliminate him if the situation ever turned dire for Vader. Seeing the couple's reunion, however, Fett relented and decided not to take the sniper shot that would have killed Starkiller. The other clone also chose to stand down, either out of sympathy or because his orders had been to act if Vader was in danger, which he currently was not. And so, the battle was seemingly won for the Rebel Alliance. With Vader in custody, it was decided that he would be transported to a secure location aboard the Rogue Shadow, with Starkiller supervising his transportation. That said, few believed Vader would really cave under interrogation. Up until the assault on Kamino, the conflicts we looked at today were small-scale operations regardless of how important they were. Whether it was the rescue of the Rebel Alliance's founding members on board the Death Star, the rescue of a rising Rebel Admiral, or the rescue of Rahm Kota from Cato Nemoria, these were all victories without which the Rebel Alliance and its cause would have been either lost or severely impacted. However, they were still small scale and because of that, not well known throughout the galaxy. This is why the assault on Kamino truly stands out as the first true Rebel Alliance victory. Finally, with the Rebel fleet triumphing on Kamino, the Rebels had a large-scale victory to show for their efforts. Finally, they had taken the Empire on in a direct and open confrontation, with ship turning on ship and ground forces clashing amid the ruins of a city. For the first time, the Rebels had taken on the superior might of the Empire, and not only won, but left the battlefield with the supreme commander of the Empire's forces in custody. This was the first real victory the Rebels had won that the galaxy at large learnt about, and it had long-reaching consequences. Not only did it damage the image of the Empire's ironclad hold on the galaxy, but it also inspired the people that the Empire could truly be defeated. As Wilhuf Tarkin once said, the greatest way to control people was through fear, and the Rebels' victory on Kamino was the first step in releasing the galaxy from the chokehold the Empire had placed around them. This was only the beginning of the Galactic Civil War. These first battles were what established the rebellion and began building up its reputation, but the hardest battles were yet to come. In the years that followed, the Alliance would win many more, but it would also suffer devastating losses. In our next video in this series, we'll be taking a look at some of the most important battles of the Galactic Civil War. We hope to see you next time as we continue to explore this chapter of Legends, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in that next video.